Thank you, Kate. And thank you all for coming, my regulars and my newcomers. I appreciate all. I'll tell you a little bit about the project to begin with if you've not been familiar with it. Catawba County is unique in the United States in the level at which it has provided public and private partnerships for historic preservation, for heritage, and most of all to write a story that tells about the people who are part of this great county. I began that task in 1989 to help write a book for the sesquicentennial of the county. And I made two promises. I promised that I would research every topic possible and that I would be fair to all the different elements of the society. I then proceeded to start to lie about finishing it, and I'm still lying. As I like to make the joke, I've told Catawbans more lies than anyone else in my life, cumulatively or singularly. But we are very close to the end, so to speak. For the last 6 months, I was fortunate enough to get a leave from the college and work here in Hickory and Newton and elsewhere in the county. I have, over the last 6 months, read every Hickory Daily Record from 1945 to 1992. And I got eye strain because the microfilm really, really is bad. And I have taken notes on just about every topic that you can imagine, not necessarily in every detail. I, for example, could not tell you off the top of my head the total history of the museum, but somewhere in a file I might be able to find it. I've also read every town board minutes for 40 years for all 7 municipalities that you have. I have yet to complete Brookford, and just this morning I left out 5 years of Conover, but I may not go back if you promise not to tell me. What's the point of the project? The point of the project is to glorify a people who celebrate their home. And that's essentially what I've attempted to do. It is a kind of history that hasn't been particularly popular the last 30 years. Most history now is written as topical. So for example, your reference to the furniture industry in Hickory, there would be a logical book that someone would write the history of furniture in this area, and they would cover it through time, focusing on furniture. What has gone out of style, yet I continue to do it, is the study of community, or as I like to call it, communitas, to sound like I have a PhD. And that is essentially the notion that community persists through time. It is taught either implicitly or explicitly from generation to generation, and that it should be the cause both of your celebration of your heritage, and it should help you or instill in you the pride to continue to make the community what you want to do and what you want it to be. Now that doesn't mean there aren't warts. There are lots of warts, and there are lots of things that you would necessarily be slightly less prideful of, but nevertheless, the story I've tried to tell is that the Catawbans as a group never cease to try to make their history, and they never ever tire of telling others what is the reason their history is worth telling. And that in many ways is what my talk is today, is to talk about the question, why here, why in 1944, and why would, as my title suggests, there be these people called Artful Catawbans? And if you looked at the title, you might ask the question, what's the dodge? Now the reference in the title is to a Dickens character called, does anybody remember? The Artful Dodger, who was something of a con man, yet something of a good, sincere, good-hearted man. And he gave me the idea in trying to put together how you explain the Catawbans in the post-war period, and I simply flipped the words. It isn't that Catawbans were Dodgers, even if they were Brooklyn fans, although I found none in the papers, but rather the fact that I have considered that what distinguished this county in ways you may not know right off the bat is how artful it was. How artful it was. And it was artful in ways that help us understand why in 1944 people here would put an art museum where there was none anywhere nearby. In other words, why this one, as opposed to, say, Statesville, Morganton, Shelby, any place nearby you want to mention, or even my town, Salisbury? No one had anything like this, or as I would argue to you, no one had the same kind of dream in 1944 that Paul Whitener and his colleagues in this crime, so to speak, had. Now, why is that? Well, there's a whole host of reasons that help suggest why the Hickory Art Museum, or Museum of Art, came to be and why it thrived. The first one's very simple, and that is the fact that Hickory aspired to be urban, even though, at least demographically and statistically, it didn't quite do it. You may not know, but originally Hickory was a relatively small place. It was a circle that circled Union Square, and it was surrounded by the communities that you now take for granted as part of Hickory. They included Westmont or West Hickory, Longview, what became Viewmont, what was originally called parts of Windy City, and the smallest yet in some ways most interesting one of all, which was Brookford. These were all sort of suburbs. And in the 1930s, Big Bad Hickory, like a bear, tried to annex them. But as I explained in Volume 2, nothing ever happens in Catawba County without contention. They never don't argue about anything. And that was the case with the original views of annexation. But Hickory and its leaders never ceased to try. And they simply appropriated a name that turned them into a city. They called themselves Greater Hickory, which actually doubled their size without any cost. You didn't have to send the fire truck if you just changed the name, as opposed to the town boundary. In Greater Hickory, we need to do what? That? How's that? Is that better? Okay, I am sorry I didn't know that.
No.
And Greater Hickory actually had the mass to begin to aspire to be more urban. So whether it was the kind of things that you could experience at the Civic Auditorium, or the type of food that you could eat in the dining room at the Hotel Hickory, or the variety of merchandise that you could purchase at Union Square, what essentially had happened by the 1940s was the fact that Hickory was on its way to being a city, and you generally associate art museums with urban places. So in a way, you can simply say Hickory had, in 1944, the aspiration to be a city, so why not have a museum first, and then build the city around the museum? And there is an element of truth to what happened with that. Now, the second aspect that I think helps understand the museum is the character that Hickory had, which was a mixed character. Now, let me explain what I mean. I could write a book that would attempt to prove to you that Hickory is not a southern place. That might surprise you or annoy you, depending upon what you said. And that doesn't mean that I'm right, but it means that essentially there are enough elements in the heritage and the old economies of Hickory that you could argue that fundamentally it's as much a northern place as it is a southern place. In fact, you can also make the argument that Hickory was always in the edge between two places. Those places are simple. If you look to the north and to the northwest, you see the foothills, and on a good day at the right place, the Blue Ridge itself. And if you head to the southeast, you will eventually arrive at Sherrills Ford, and you will eventually be in the south. Catawba County itself was very much like North Carolina. It was a matter of variegation and degree as you went up in elevation, in our case from the southeast to the northwest. And when you are at Terrell, or Sherrills Ford, or Chronicle, as it was called, where 150 and 321 meet, it was called essentially the South. And it acted like the South. It had the same basic social dynamics. It had the same tenant farmers. It had the same devotion to cotton. And if you went a little further west to Maiden, you were in the stereotypical southern mill town. But by the time you got to North Newton, on your way up here, you had begun to see a transition. And by the time you enter Greater Hickory, it is not just hillier, but it is less southern. Little bits of cotton, not much else, and a diversified industry or a diversified industrial base that was the envy of this entire region. In fact, the easiest way to interpret why in 1944 you could have an art museum is that you weren't Kannapolis, that you weren't even Charlotte, that you had more of a diversification of those who had used industrialization to carve out fortunes and create communities. And you had enough variety within that to draw upon to create an art museum. So what you had in Hickory was the cusp between a southern ethic, which had a particular class basis, and a northern ethic, which had, shall we say, a more cultural basis. The culture of the entrepreneur, the idea of anyone can transcend their origins, and Hickory had a lot of that. Thirdly, you weren't in the mountains, but you can certainly what? See them from here. And we often overlook the extreme, I won't say extreme, the extensive influence which the nearby mountains had on the entire development of this city, particularly in the early days. Think of your place names. And this becomes important, I think, to help you understand this museum. Westmont, Viewmont, Mountain View, Claremont, this building itself, this town. In every case, what are you doing? You aren't in the mountains, but you're what? Looking at them. When we finish the talk today, go back and look at the very first painting that was given here, that Mr. Shuford got. What are you looking at? You're looking at mountains. And there's almost a biblical admonition here. And that is, of course, I will lift my eyes to the hills, from whence cometh my help. And in case of Hickory, from whence come my capital and my raw materials, to both pursue commerce and industry in the early days. If you look carefully at the early paintings, and they are wonderfully reproduced in the book that came out 20 years ago that Mrs. Code edited, they are invariably scenes that look like they are in Catawba County, but they come from elsewhere. Why were they bought? Where's the abstracts? Where's the soup cans? Where's Hickory's vision? Well, Hickory's vision is very simple. It looked to the hills from whence it got both the materials, the labor, and I think in some ways the viewpoint, if you will, for what kind of community it wanted to have. And I'll leave aside any blowing rock jokes, of course, you know, that if you made any money, you just simply went up there. But clearly in the beginnings of this museum, 1944, etc., Hickory is a town on the edge. It is between Appalachia and the South, and therefore it carves its own identity. And because of its diversified base, it essentially could have a museum when others didn't see it, and perhaps many did not even want it. Now you say, okay, that sounds good. You've been figuring this out. This may even be in the book. It will be, and some details that follow. Where's your proof? So you made the hypothesis. What's the proof? Well, the proof came in all places in 1955, 10 years or so into this museum's existence, when General Electric came to Conover. Now, all of you know, if you've been here a while, that General Electric was a milestone event in the history of this county because it brought in both a national corporation, one of the first, and because it brought in, as they like to whisper, labor unions, etc., to a very conservative, proprietary community. By the way, if you go back and look at all the labor union votes, 40% of all workers in this city always voted for unions. So yes, it is true you were anti-labor union, but there was a minority. There is a consistent vote pattern all the way through it. My favorite story, by the way, is at Southern Desk, one of the most artful places I've ever read about or studied. I actually am writing the book on the southern desk. They once had a funeral for the Union. They actually built a coffin in the factory and buried the Union in the vote out in the backyard. I would love to find that. We would make that one of our great art objects. Now, what's GE got to do with the museum in Hickory? Well, it's very simple. GE said it chose Hickory because how could a podunky little place in the foothills of North Carolina sponsor a museum? They must have something that all those other yahoos don't, besides just cheap labor. And that is exactly what they said. When the announcement was made that Hickory and Catawba County had acquired GE, J.P. Huskins, the editor of the Record and Landmark in Statesville, went livid. He went ballistic. And he wrote an editorial column in the paper there, literally blistering his local city fathers for failing to bring a painting, any kind of painting, to Statesville to try to lure those Yankees in. And he said very, very clearly and very, very simply, we got out-painted. Now, many of you who are patrons of this museum, what did Mr. Shuford say, legendarily? If you're going to have a museum, you have to have paintings. Well, paintings particularly. So by the way, what did J. Huskins do after that? He went out and got a mummy. If you've ever been to the Iredell museums, they have a mummy that they got in the 50s. It's a kind of minor league mummy, but oh my God, it's the most amazing thing that ever came to Statesville. And that's what they did in compensation. That's what art is in Iredell. It's a coffin, but that's another story. But think about that. GE said Hickory sold itself. Now, what did they really mean? We have no proof that any GE executive ever liked the paintings or looked at the paintings. But the very fact that you had this museum in its second building, struggling to get by, occasionally when the floor fell in, as Mrs. Coe tells in her reminiscences, you had a community that stood out from the others and wanted to be something that no one else was really caring about. So GE came. And so did CommScope, its predecessor. And all the companies which come here from across, literally the globe in the next 40 years, you can make the argument that the museum was, in a sense, the tip of the seesaw. And the fact that the paintings were there and that the other art followed was in itself Hickory's attempt to truly become an urban place of diversification and sophistication that I hope all of you, in a sense, share. So that's really the story, except I still haven't told you why I think Catawbans are so artful. So let me turn to that, and then I'll let questions, and then I'll go into chapter 2. I'm going to have a section in this next book called The Artful Catawban. And I got the idea, of all things, in looking at the solicitations for the United Way, what used to be called the United Fund. And it dawned on me that being a Hickoryite was an art form. That this was a city, unlike others, where there was a little tight-packed elite who were in one place and didn't share. And that this town, although it had its elite, and still does, nevertheless had pockets of others who interacted, and if you learned how to, shall we say, play the game, or paint by numbers, you got ahead. And the book will be full of examples of people from all areas of Hickory who became artful. That meant that they pitched in when the United Fund came to ask them to be a division head, whether it was one of the wives of one of the Shuford industrialists, or it was the young attorney Charlie Dixon, or it was a young banker who was the manager of the branch at Beaumont, or it was the long-neglected leaders of Ridgeview, who are actually the first African Americans to get their pictures on the front page of the Hickory Daily Record because they are pitching in to the United Fund, particularly the year 1961, when Ridgeview made its goal first before any other element of the community. Art seems to be the tie that binds Hickory. In a broad spectrum of what art is, from how you behave when you go to a party, from how you learn to do things here in this building that was really just a huge factory for many years. Whether you then go on to Lenore-Rhine, where the professors attempted to instill both religion and humanities with a good dose of religion as your spice, but not so much just to prepare you to be a Lutheran, but to prepare you to be a greater Catawban. If you do the data, Lenore-Rhine is as much a municipal institution of higher learning for Hickory as it is the Lutheran denominational college. And in fact, the basis for much of what becomes Hickory is partly the way in which you were given the discipline to go forth when you go through Lenore-Rhine. But the test is always with the United Fund. In ways you'll hear in the book, those who reach the top go through that conduit. And when you pay close attention to all the things they do, even their silly little follies when they celebrate their success, it is an art form. And what I find is that Hickory, more than other towns, I have studied other towns, Statesville, Salisbury, Concord, etc., there is a sense of the artful person that is here that I don't see elsewhere. That is even very different when you get to Newton, where Newton has more of that southern gentility and settled ways, yet Newton itself had its own sense of art form that mostly dealt with history as opposed to contrived or manufactured art. And it too has a sense of it, but nothing like Hickory. In fact, I'm not even sure that that isn't partly the source of the great competition between Hickory and the rest of the county. Hard to tell. They argue so much that you can't quite tell what they're arguing about. So at least until you had the great annexation wars to see who would own the McDonald's on Fairgrove Church Road, you know, it's a little hard to figure out exactly who's saying who. The Catawbans were artful. Very artful in ways that Paul Whitener himself simply started the motion with and simply brought forth a kind of spirit that ends up being this. Otherwise, why would Harley Shuford have cared that this building survived? Because you go home today, right around downtown Hickory, and realize it ain't there. They tore it down. One of the most shocking things I found was the extent to which urban renewal changed the face of the core of the community. Not Union Square itself, but in all the surrounding blocks. Over 60 buildings demolished in 5 years. Buildings that today you would show off in Southern living as urban renewal, cultural renewal, etc. And this building was, to use a pun, on the block. When Harley Shuford decided, with his prestige and obviously his connections to his and other people's money, to make sure this building stayed. Why? Well, Harley himself said a lot of reasons, that we needed an art center, we needed a science center, and that this building had been a heart of the community. But it had a name that he revived, and others like him. They called it Claremont. Once again, it was the vision of what you could see from Hickory that made Hickory believe in what its art could say. And that's what struck me in preparing for the talk. And you can see it again. I urge you to look at that first painting and how this sense that wherever you go and whatever art you look at, if it's rustic, if it has horizon, if it has common folks in it, if it has imaginative color, as Paul Whitener's paintings downstairs show, you are seeing Catawbans and Hickoryites see themselves in a way that make them as much a part of the earth as any other place. What fascinates me is the early paintings of this museum were a testament to the fact that Hickory knew where it was coming from, Hickory knew where it wanted to go, and it made sure it dodged, I'll finally get to the answer, it dodged the suffocation that industrialization brought to so many areas. That it avoided the kind of lack of excitement and color that you often found in industrial places. Now, I will tell you, Hickory is not the garden spot of the universe, but nevertheless, its variety has been here ever since the museum got here in '44. It has been sustained by the diversification of its people and its pocketbooks. And I see no reason that either the museum or the community should ever change. Otherwise, we aren't really seeing the beauty that's around us now. So I'll stop here, and I'll let anybody bring up anything they wish. I cannot tell you everything I know about the Hickory clan yet, because I haven't confirmed it. But outside of that, if you'd like to ask any local heritage questions or museum questions, go right ahead.
Yeah, that we have a suspicion there is an address in our scrapbook which no longer exists, and it's somewhere near where the Service League house is.
That would be correct. It was near the Service League.
Okay.
I'm sorry I don't know that answer. I always, when I don't know those answers, I say I don't live here. And God help you, you live here and have to find the addresses. I do know why you have those. Yes, ma'am.
My follow-up to that, could you just explain further what this building actually was, this building?
This was Claremont High School. This was Hickory High School. It was built in the 1920s. It was part of the great consolidation movement of the county schools.
So when
When
made an
Mr.
effort
Shuford,
to save this building,
yes, in the
how
80s.
did he do that?
How did he do that? He bullied Corinth United Church of Christ into letting it stay here. They owned the land beneath it, and you had to work out an agreement that you could change the use of the building for educational purposes. This was originally the site of Claremont College, which was an attempt by Hickory, again this idea of edge, to build the Wesley.
3rd Avenue Northwest, at one time all the rich people lived along the tracks, and that was basically an area where relatively poor people lived. There was basically a small house where the women's club was, and then there was another house, and then there was the Service League house, and that was the first of the house in the middle was the first was used for a long time by the museum as an art museum. I think that was a wild party or orgy one time, and the whole floor.
I do not have that documented.
In the 20s, the Shuford Mills built a headquarters right near McGuire Pub.
Yes.
And that was the widow of Alex Shuford, the second, who had drowned. She owned that building.
That's correct.
There was a fellow called Tommy Bumbarger. He's now in his early 90s and deaf as a post and blind as a bat. And he was the accountant for Mrs. Shuford. And he said, you could save money by giving this building to the art museum. And she about nearly beat him to death with the club and all, but she decided to do that. That was in the late 50s, and then it moved to this building. So it moved from right next to the Women's Club, which was, I think, Shuford property, to the McGuire's Pub place, and then to this.
I hope that helps. Yes.
Could you speak a little bit to the history of African Americans in the 1940s in Hickory?
In Hickory, just Hickory?
Yes.
Well, there's a whole section of the book on the efforts of folks at Ridgeview to acquire a better stake in the community. Ridgeview had its own social structure. It was led by a coterie of about 40 people that I find incredibly admirable, who belonged to something called the Negro Civic League originally. It would later take the name the Progressive Club. It had a number of leaders, among them E.T. Moore, who was the principal of East Hickory Elementary School in the days of segregation. And it petitioned and met, in some cases monthly, with city fathers. The result was, of course, a recreation center, a library building, etc., that became the focus of that community until the 1970s and 80s. And the book is pocketed with folks. My personal favorite is an artist, J.W. Gore, who had gone to Pittsburgh, worked for the African American newspaper in Pittsburgh, came back here after the war and became one of the directors of the Rec Center. And I have read that he was an artist. I have yet to find any of his work. I would like to put it in the book. But he is our great chronicler, and he will say subtle things like there will be a special meeting of the Progressive Club this week. News will come out about it later, and then it never comes out. And then you find out from another source that in the mid-50s, when African Americans were registering to vote in large numbers, both political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, would come to the Progressive Club to make their pitch as to who would get the vote. And he was making veiled references to that. It took Ridgeview approximately 12 years to convince city fathers to build up one sidewalk. They wanted one sidewalk along First Avenue. And that's the news. In other words, the story is a cat and mouse game between, in a sense, equality of facilities and the promise of the city to give them, but to then use technicalities to keep it from happening. By the 60s, the maintenance of the community had gone down, both by the city and by some private interest, and that's part of what becomes the volatility of the 1960s and civil rights. But Mr. Gore's the artist I'd like to see us find stuff, and I've not been able to. That sort of a good introduction.
Yes, thank you.
There was a man named John Pike. There were all kinds of people that are just fascinating to me that acted with integrity and bravery long years of struggle. Anyone else? Well, I want to thank.
I have so many. But okay, this one thing, I had heard that during the 1940s, Lenore Ryan turned into an air pilot training. Have you heard anything like that?
Oh, sure, but that's in book 2.
Okay.
Yes, there was a training program at Lenore Ryan. That's right. Every college had that.
Oh.
One of the reasons that Catawba and Lenore College had not survived World War I is that their training programs had not brought enough revenue in. And that's why Catawba closes and then is bought up by Salisbury, and Lenore has to become salvaged by Mr. Ryan. But in World War II, the money was there was so much money to fight this war that Hickory got a share. And in some ways funded much of our expansions.
A lot of the factories, did they turn over to producing war items?
No, we continued to build contract furniture, contract hosiery. We made components of the war effort, but not weaponry.
Okay.
Yes?
Any truth in the well, let me tell the question by saying, we have a major university here in Illinois. Look at it that way. They recruit.
I teach at Catawba College.
Well, great.
I'm also Lutheran, so you're right.
Well, yes. Then you should be able to answer this. A lot of people say we should be more of a university town, and it attracts industry and people to stay. We have our 40-year-olds who are judged as one of the most miserable cities in the United States to live in. And the leadership of the communities are very cantankerous in working with industry to get them to move in. And then you look at the history and they say it's not a town, a university town, because the city fathers and the university could never get on the same page to see how that would work together. Is there truth to that?
I have no evidence of that. I mean, the city fathers all went to Lenore Ryan in many cases. I mean, my feeling is that Lenore Ryan was as much your municipal college as it was a denominational school. And as far as university town today, you're asking a historian to comment on the future. I'm not sure I know how to answer that.
Right, yes.
Move to Salisbury. We get along great. So, yes.
I would like to make one comment about Lenore Ryan. I went to school there.
Yeah.
When I was there in the 50s, Lenore Ryan had a lot more day students.
Yes, and I talked about that.
Yeah, and now that has changed. We have a lot more students.
The community college and the UNC Charlotte changed that whole dynamic. And what you're really talking about, sir, is the fact that they now recruit people from everywhere. And it's really a question of the character of what the school is now as to what it is you want your community relations. And You know, that, I don't know how to answer that as a historian.
Well, it's the affordability of the school, when you look at that today, in terms of tuition rates in the
Sure.
Kent community with our average per capita income.
Sure.
A lower level than average, to be able to afford to go to.
And I don't know the answer to that one. I don't know my data. Anyone else? Well, again, I want to thank you for having me. I really want to welcome you to this painting that is your first painting, if you will see the point I'm trying to make. And of course, I hope that you have as many years of heritage here as you have behind you. So, thanks very much.
Thank you.